Welcome to Chapter 2, where we're shifting our focus from what people did for work to how their work was organized. In Chapter 1, we saw the evolution from gathering, hunting to agriculture to the beginnings of industrialization. Now we need to understand how societies decide who would do what work, who would be in charge, and how these individual efforts would be coordinated. Think about this fundamental question. How do you get hundreds or thousands of people to work together effectively when there are no HR departments, no written job descriptions, no modern management techniques? The answer is that traditional societies developed somewhat remarkably sophisticated systems based on social categories that people were born into. This chapter examines several key organizational principles that dominated work for thousands of years: family relationships, ascribed statuses like gender and age, slavery, caste systems, and guild organizations. While some of these may seem outdated, you'll be surprised how many of these patterns persist in modern workplaces. As we go through this material, I want you to think about the tension between efficiency and fairness. Some of these traditional systems were quite effective at organizing work, but they often did so at the cost of individual freedom and opportunity. This tension between organizational effectiveness and individual rights is something we still struggle with today. Let's start with two fundamental concepts that explain how traditional societies allocated work: ascribed status versus achieved status. This distinction is crucial for understanding historical and contemporary work organization. An ascribed status is a position in society based on characteristics you cannot change. You are born with them. The most obvious examples are biological sex, age, race, and ethnicity. You can't wake up tomorrow and decide to be a different gender, race, or age. Well, mostly. These characteristics are largely immutable. An achieved status, by contrast, is something you earn through your own ability, effort, training, or a combination of these factors. In modern society, we like to think that most work positions are achieved statuses, that you get jobs based on your qualifications, not on who you were born as. But here's the key insight. For most of human history, work roles were allocated primarily based on ascribed characteristics. If you were born male in medieval Europe, certain occupations were open to you and others were closed. If you were born female, you had a completely different set of possibilities. If you were born into a particular family, caste, or ethnic group, your work life was largely predetermined. The system had some advantages. It eliminated a lot of uncertainty and conflict about who would do that. But it also meant that individual talents and preferences were often irrelevant. A brilliant woman might be stuck doing domestic work, while a less capable man could become a guild craftsman simply because of their genders. Understanding this historical pattern helps us see why movements for equal opportunity have been so important and why they have often been met with such resistance. It's crucial to understand that while ascribed statuses were universally used to organize work, the specific assignments varied dramatically across societies. This tells us something really important. These arrangements weren't based on biological necessity, but on cultural choices. Take gender roles, for example. We saw in Chapter 1 that among the Kungsan, men hunt and women gather. But when we look at agricultural societies, the picture becomes more complex. Volti's research shows that in horticultural societies, men did most of the crop cultivation in only 28% of the cases. In the remaining 72%, women either did most of the cultivation or it was shared equally between men and women. This variation continued into more complex agricultural societies. In traditional China, picking cotton, tea, and mulberry leaves was considered women's work, while rice cultivation was exclusively men's domain. But in Japan and Southeast Asia, transplanting and harvesting rice was primarily done by women. Same crop, completely different gender assignments. Age categories are equally flexible across cultures. In some societies, a 14-year-old is considered an adult ready for full work responsibilities. In others, like our own, we don't expect people to take on adult work roles until their 20s or even later. At the other end of life, some cultures view elderly people as invaluable sources of wisdom and experience, while others see them as obsolete. This cultural variation is really important because it shows us that many of the work arrangements we take for granted aren't natural or inevitable. They're social choices that could be made differently. For most of human history, the family wasn't just where you lived, it was where you worked. In fact, the distinction between family and work unit didn't really exist. Volti quotes a description of 17th and 18th century French rural life that could apply to most pre-industrial societies. The family and the enterprise coincide. The head of the family is at the same time the head of the enterprise. This meant that your work role was largely determined by your position in the family structure. Fathers typically had overall authority and did the heaviest physical labor. Mothers managed household production, everything from brewing beer to making clothes to preserving food. Children had age appropriate tasks that gradually prepared them for adult roles. But we shouldn't romanticize this arrangement or assume it was always oppressive to women. While women rarely had formal authority, their economic contributions were absolutely essential. On farms, women were responsible for gardens, poultry, dairy production, food preservation, and countless other tasks that meant the difference between prosperity and poverty. In craft enterprises, women often worked alongside their husbands and sometimes took over the businesses when their husbands died. The key point is that this wasn't separate sphere ideology where men worked and women stayed home. Everyone worked, but their work was organized around family relationships rather than individual qualification or market forces. This family-based organization persists well into the industrial era and still influences how we think about work today. Think about family businesses, expectations about work-life balance, or debates about nepotism in hiring. Family-based work organization was so persistent because it solved several key organizational problems that all work groups face. Let me tell you through Let me walk you through how family ties address these challenges. First, task assignment and coordination. In a family enterprise, everyone knows their role based on their family position. The father makes major decisions, the mother coordinates daily operations, older children supervise younger ones, and so on. This does eliminate a lot of negotiation and conflict about who's responsible for what. Second, organizational hierarchy. Families provide ready-made authority structure based on age and gender. This isn't necessarily fair by modern standards, but it does provide clear lines of authority without having to negotiate who's in charge. Third, trust. This is huge. Family members have long-term intensive relationships that make it harder to cheat or shirk responsibility. You can't just quit and find another job if you're working with your parents and siblings. You're stuck with these people, so you have a strong incentive to maintain good relationships. Fourth, motivation. The honor and respect that comes from supporting your family can be incredibly powerful motivators. Think about immigrants today who work multiple jobs to support family members back home, or young people who sacrifice personal goals to help family businesses. Family loyalty can drive people to work harder than any external reward system. This doesn't mean family-based work was always harmonious. Family conflicts often are intense, and there's often exploitation of younger or less powerful family members, but it did provide a stable framework for organizing complex work activities. Now we turn to one of the darkest chapters in work organization, slavery. Slavery represents the most extreme example of work allocation based on described status, in this case usually race or ethnicity. What made slavery so pernicious was that it wasn't just an economic arrangement, but was reinforced by legal, social, cultural, and political power that seemingly created impermeable boundaries between the enslaved and the free. It's important to understand that slavery has been practiced throughout history and across virtually all societies at some point. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome all relied heavily on slave labor. Medieval Europe used slave labor extensively, and slavery persisted in various forms well into the modern era. The word slave itself comes from Slav, referring to Eastern European people who were frequently enslaved through military conquest. This points to one common source of slavery: warfare between different ethnic groups. Winners enslaved losers, often justifying this by claiming ethnic or cultural superiority. But slavery could also be based on other ascribed characteristics. In the American South, slavery was primarily based on race, with any African ancestry sufficient to subject someone to enslavement. In some societies, slavery was hereditary. Children of slaves automatically became slaves themselves, regardless of their individual characteristics or abilities. What made slavery particularly damaging was its permanence. Unlike other forms of unfree labor that might be temporary or allow for eventual freedom, slavery often trapped people and their descendants indefinitely in conditions of involuntary servitude. Despite being practiced for thousands of years, slavery was actually a remarkably inefficient way to organize work. This inefficiency had several sources that help us understand why it eventually became economically obsolete. First, motivation problems. Slaves were a fixed cost for owners. They had to be fed, housed, and clothed, regardless of how hard they worked. This meant slaves had a few incentives to work efficiently or take initiative. Work had to be coerced through punishment, which required constant supervision. Second, skills and innovation. Slavery worked reasonably well for simple repetitive tasks that could be closely monitored, like picking cotton or working in mines, but it was poorly suited to work requiring creativity, problem solving, or attention to detail. You can force someone to pick cotton, but you can't force them to innovate or care about quality. Third, technological stagnation. Slavery inhibited technological development in several ways. Most directly, slave owners had little incentive to invest in labor-saving technology when human labor was readily available. More subtly, slavery contributed to cultural attitudes that looked down on manual work and practical problem solving. This last point is really important. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Aristotle argued that engaging in manual labor or working for others was incompatible with the virtues expected of free citizens. This attitude discouraged the kind of hands-on experimentation that drives technological innovation. The result was economic stagflation. Societies that relied heavily on slave labor, like the American South, often fell behind economically compared to regions that used free labor and were more open to technological innovation. The caste system, most fully developed in India, represents another way that societies have used ascribed status to organize work. A caste is a group that claims common ancestry and practices endogamy, marriage within the group. What makes caste systems distinctive is their hereditary nature and their religious justification. In traditional India, society was arranged into four major castes hierarchically. Brahmins are priests and scholars. Kshatriyas are warriors and rulers. Uh, Vaishya are farmer and merchants, and Shudras are artisans and laborers. Below these stood the Dalits, or untouchable, whose work was considered so polluting that any contact with them was thought to contaminate higher caste individuals. This hierarchy was justified through beliefs about karma, the idea that your current life circumstances reflect actions in past lives. Being born into a low caste meant you had accumulated bad karma in previous incarnations. Being born into a high caste suggested spiritual merit from past lives. What's fascinating about the caste system is how thoroughly it integrated religious beliefs, social organization, and economic roles. Your spiritual status, your social position, and your occupation were all determined by the family you were born into. This created incredibly stable social arrangements that persisted for thousands of years. The caste system also shows how ascribed status can create elaborate occupational specialization. Within each major caste were numerous jati, or subcaste, often associated with specific occupations. There were jati for weavers, potters, blacksmiths, barbers, washermen, and hundreds of other specialized roles. The relationship between caste status and occupational prestige in India reveals some interesting complexities. Generally, higher caste status did correspond to more prestigious work, but there were important exceptions that show how this system actually functioned. For example, many occupations were considered polluting because they involved contact with dead animals, bodily substances, or other ritually impure materials. Leather workers, sweepers, and washermen were typically drawn from Dalit communities because high caste individuals couldn't perform this work without losing their ritual purity. This is where it gets interesting. Brahmins, who occupy the highest position in the caste hierarchy, often worked as cooks, not typically a high status occupation. Why? Because as member of the highest caste, Brahmins could cook for anyone without polluting the food. A lower caste cook would contaminate food prepared for higher caste individuals. This shows how caste status could actually override economic consideration. The ritual purity of the worker mattered more than the inherent prestige or economic value of the work itself. It's also important to note that caste position didn't always determine economic power. In many localities, the market value of particular goods and services was more important than caste status in determining workers' bargaining power with clients. In recent decades, the caste system has weakened considerably due to urbanization, education, democratic politics, and economic modernization. The Indian government has even implemented affirmative action programs for disadvantaged caste. But caste influences still persist, especially in rural areas and in marriage patterns. Now we come to one of the most sophisticated and successful forms of work organization in pre-industrial times, the guild system. Guilds dominated urban work organization in medieval and early modern Europe for hundreds of years. Understanding how they work gives us insights into alternative ways of organizing economic activity that are quite different from modern capitalism. A guild was essentially a group of skilled workers who performed a particular task or who produced a particular product within a single town or city. There were guilds for weavers, stonemasons, metalsmiths, shoemakers, bakers, and dozens of other craft occupations. Some places even had guilds for beggars and thieves. But guilds were much more than just work organization. They served as mutual aid societies, providing assistance to members in difficulty. They had strong religious components. Each guild had a patron saint, and guild members participated together in religious processions and festivals. They provided social identity and community belonging in ways that modern professional associations rarely match. The guild system was fundamentally different from modern market-based organization. While we expect workers and businesses to compete with each other, guilds were explicitly designed to limit competition and protect their members from market pressure. Where guild power was strong, you could practice a particular craft only as a member of the relevant guild. This gave guilds enormous power and control over who could work, how they could work, and what they could charge for their products. The guild system was fundamentally anti-competitive, and this was by design. Guild members believed they lived in what economists call a zero-sum economy, one that grew slowly, if at all. In such an environment, one's personal gain necessarily came at another's expense. So instead of competing to drive each other out of the business, guild members cooperated to ensure everyone could make a decent living. Guilds controlled competition in several ways. They limited the number of people who could practice each craft, preventing an oversupply of workers. They regulated the quality and quantity of goods produced, preventing members from gaining advantages through shoddy workmanship or overproduction. They often set standard prices, preventing ruinous price competition. When demand for guild products was high, the limited membership meant higher prices and good incomes. When demand dropped, guilds prevented catastrophic competition by limiting what each member could produce. Individual incomes might decline, but no one would be out of business. This system reflected medieval Christian values about economic life. The concept of just price suggests that producers should charge no more than necessary for a decent level of subsistence. Maximizing profit at others' expense was considered morally questionable. Modern economists often criticize guilds for inhibiting efficiency and innovation, and there is some truth to this. Guild regulations did sometimes prevent beneficial changes, but they also provided economic security and social stability that pure market systems cannot match. The guild system shows us there are alternatives to winner-take-all competitive market and ways of organizing economic activity that prioritize stability and community welfare over maximum efficiency. The apprenticeship system was the heart of the guild organization and one of the most successful educational institutions in history. Before universities became widespread, apprenticeship was virtually the only way to learn a skilled trade. Even the learned professions, medicine, law, and clergy, made extensive use of apprenticeships alongside university education. Apprenticeship was a formal status, usually based on a sworn oath or contract between the apprentice parents and a master craftsman. Remember, apprentices were often children or teenagers who had not reached the age of majority, so their parents had to guarantee the agreement. The apprentice agreed to work for stipulated periods, sometimes 10 years or more, and promised not to leave the master or get married without permission. In return, the master promised to teach the apprentice the mysteries or skills of the craft and provide room, board, and clothing. This was an educational and economic arrangement. Apprentices provided cheap labor while they learned, essentially paying for their education through their work. Masters got low-cost workers in exchange for training that would eventually enable apprentices to become competitors. The apprenticeship period was also crucial for occupational socialization, learning not just the technical skills of a craft, but the values, norms, and attitudes of people in that trade. Apprentices often lived in their master's household, taking meals with the family and participating in guild, religious, and social activities. The business aspects of apprenticeship reveal how sophisticated these arrangements actually were. These weren't just informal mentoring relationships, they were carefully structured economic contracts that balanced the interests of multiple parties. From the apprentice perspective, they were essentially taking out a loan to finance their education. Instead of paying money up front, they paid with years of low-wage labor. The master was investing in training costs and accepting the risk that the apprentice might leave before the investment was recouped. To make this work, both sides needed assurances. Masters needed guarantees that apprentices would stay for the full term and work diligently. Apprentices needed assurance that they would actually receive training, not just be used as cheap labor. The formal contracts addressed these concerns. Violation of the agreement by either side could result in cash penalties. If a master failed to provide proper training, they might have to pay compensation. If an apprentice left early, their family might owe money to the master. The system also had a built-in quality control. Masters had reputations to maintain within the guild community. An apprentice who received poor training would struggle to advance, which would reflect badly on their master. This gave masters incentives to provide genuine education, not just exploit cheap labor. For apprentices from craft families, fees were often lower or waived entirely. Family ties provided sufficient assurance of worthiness, trustworthiness, and commitment. The progression from apprentice to full guild member was carefully structured to maintain guild control while providing advanced opportunities. After completing their apprenticeship, most workers became journeymen, a term that comes from the French word for day, journée, because they were typically paid daily wages. Many people assume journeymen travel from place to place developing their skills, and some did, but most were actually long-term employees who remained at the journeyman level for their entire careers. Only a minority ever advanced to become masters and full guild members. To achieve master status, journeymen had to demonstrate their skills by creating a masterpiece, a finished product that showed they had mastered all aspects of their craft. This wasn't just about technical skill, but also about understanding quality standards, design principles, and production methods. But creating a masterpiece was only the beginning. Aspiring masters also needed sufficient capital to set up their own shop, the ability to pay fees to government officials, and acceptance by existing guild members. This last requirement was crucial. Guilds could essentially veto applicants they did not want as competitors. This system served multiple functions. It maintained quality standards by ensuring only skilled practitioners could become masters. It limited the number of independent producers, protecting existing members from excessive competition, and it preserved the guild's social cohesion by giving current members control over who could join their ranks. The guild system was remarkably successful, surviving for hundreds of years across much of Europe. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, guilds came under attack from two directions: political opposition from emerging nation-states and economic pressure from new forms of production. The political assault came from national governments that were consolidating power and eliminating competing sources of authority. Nation-states, even democratic ones, have little tolerance for organizations that regulate themselves and remain outside state control. Guilds represented exactly this kind of autonomous power. The solution was simple and brutal: legislative abolition. France eliminated guilds in 1791 during the Revolution. England abolished them in 1835. Germany followed in 1869. This wasn't gradual economic evolution, it was political destruction of institutions that had functioned successfully for centuries. But guilds were also under economic pressure from new forms of production. The putting out system we discussed in Chapter 1 bypassed guild organization by using rural workers who weren't guild members. The growth of long-distance commerce expanded markets beyond the local areas where guilds could maintain monopolies. Most importantly, the rise of capitalism shifted economic priorities from stability and security toward growth and efficiency. Guilds were designed for a static economy where the goal was preserving everyone's livelihood. Capitalism required flexibility, innovation, and creative destruction that guild restrictions inhibited. The technological changes of the Industrial Revolution delivered the final blow by making many guild crafts obsolete and replacing skilled artisans with machines. The economic critique of guilds was most famously articulated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Smith argued that guild restrictions prevented the free movement of labor that was essential for efficient markets. In England, The Elizabethan statute of apprenticeship required 7 years of apprenticeship before someone could practice a craft. Smith pointed out that this created serious labor market distortions. Declining industries were stuck with surplus workers who couldn't easily shift to other occupations. Growing industries couldn't get enough workers because of apprenticeship requirements. The result was that some workers received high wages while others barely survived, not because of their productivity, but because of artificial restrictions. Guilds have also been accused of suppressing technological innovation. There is some truth to this. Guilds were conservative institutions designed to maintain stability, and technological change can be destabilizing. Guild regulations often explicitly prohibit innovations that might disrupt established practices, but the relationship between guilds and innovation was more complex. While guild restrictions may have discouraged some innovations, the apprenticeship system was crucial for preserving and transmitting technical knowledge. Most technological skills couldn't be learned from books. They required hands-on practice under expert guidance. The long apprenticeship period served both economic and educational functions. Yes, they provided cheap labor for masters, but they also ensured thorough training in complex skills. The system successfully transmitted technical knowledge across generations for hundreds of years. While traditional guilds disappeared in the 19th century, many of their characteristics persist in modern professional organizations. Today's professions, doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, share remarkable similarities with medieval guilds. Like guilds, professions control entry through educational requirements and licensure. Like guilds, they maintain quality standards through professional codes and disciplinary procedures. Like guilds, they resist pure market competition through regulations that limit who can practice and how they compete. Modern professional associations like medieval guilds serve multiple functions beyond just regulating work. They provided continuing education, social networking, mutual support, and professional identity. They lobby for favorable legislation and represent their members' interests to the public. The similarities are not coincidental. Professions face many of the same organizational challenges that guilds addressed. How do you maintain quality standards? How do you prevent ruinous competition? How do you ensure adequate training? How do you build trust with clients? The solutions often involve restricting competition through barriers to entry, professional licensing, and codes of conduct that limit certain types of competitive behavior. We'll explore these modern professional arrangements in much more detail in Chapter 9. For now, just remember that organizational principles we've studied in this chapter, ascribed status, family ties, guild-like restrictions, haven't disappeared. They've evolved and taken new forms, but they continue to influence how work is organized today. As we wrap up our examination of pre-industrial work organization, I want you to think about the fundamental tensions we have explored. Traditional societies developed sophisticated ways to organize work that provided stability, security, and social cohesion. Family-based enterprises, caste systems, and guilds all succeeded in coordinating complex economic activities for hundreds or thousands of years. But these systems also restricted individual freedom and opportunity. If you were born into the wrong family, caste, or gender, your life chances were severely limited regardless of your talents or efforts. The same ascribed status that provided organizational stability also perpetuated inequality and blocked social mobility. Modern societies have largely rejected ascribed status in favor of achieved status, the idea that position should be based on merit rather than birth. But as we'll see in future chapters, ascribed characteristics like gender, race, and family background continue to influence work opportunities in subtle and not so subtle ways. The guild system in particular offers us a fascinating alternative to pure market competition. Guilds prioritize stability and community welfare over maximum efficiency. They provided economic security for their members, but at the cost of restricting innovation and limiting opportunities for outsiders. These historical patterns will help us understand the organizational revolutions that accompanied industrialization. The next chapter examines how the Industrial Revolution created entirely new ways of organizing work, ways that emphasized efficiency and productivity over stability and tradition.